The air was thick with tension. Margaret stood at the doorstep, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched Thomas, her husband of 8 years, kiss another woman. The woman's long, golden hair shimmered in the early evening sun, and her laughter was like a soft melody that made Margaret's heart ache. But what hurt the most was the way Thomas looked at her. It was a look Margaret had once known well, a look of love, affection, and promise. Now it was all gone, replaced by something she had never imagined could happen to her. The woman's name was Clara, and Margaret had never known she existed until today. Thomas had left her for Clara, for a life that was new and exciting, a life that didn't include the quiet moments they once shared, or the deep bond they had formed. The house that once felt like home now felt cold and empty. Margaret stood frozen, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before her eyes. The two lovers didn't notice her standing there, watching them from the shadows of the front porch. She could hear their conversation, their whispers of sweet words, as if she wasn't there. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of betrayal, something in her stirred, a deep, primal urge to make things right. Margaret had always believed in fighting for love, for what was hers. She would not let her marriage slip away so easily. So she stepped forward, stepping into their world, her eyes fierce with determination. The secret she carried with her was one that would change everything. Just as Margaret was about to confront Thomas, Clara turned to look at her, a sly smile playing at the corner of her lips. Margaret felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. What was Clara planning? What would happen next? Her heart raced as she opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, Clara took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with an unreadable emotion. "Margaret," Clara said, her voice soft but full of meaning, "you're not the only one who knows how to keep a secret." It had all started 2 years ago, when Margaret and Thomas had first met. They were both young and full of dreams. Margaret was a kind and loving woman, always quick to help those in need, while Thomas was ambitious, driven, and charismatic. They made a perfect match, or so Margaret had thought. Their wedding was the talk of the town. People spoke of the grand ceremony, the laughter, and the promises made under the clear blue sky. Life seemed perfect, but as the years went by, things slowly started to change. Thomas became more distant, consumed with his work and career. Margaret, on the other hand, was content with their simple life. She focused on maintaining their home, keeping everything in order, and making sure Thomas had everything he needed when he came home. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The spark that had once burned brightly between them was fading. She tried everything, surprising him with his favorite meals, planning weekend getaways, and even giving him space when he needed it. But nothing seemed to bring him back to her. Then, one day, Thomas came home late, his face flushed, his eyes avoiding hers. Margaret could feel the tension in the air. She asked him what was wrong, but he only shrugged it off, muttering something about work. She didn't press him further, but the unease in her heart grew. She knew something was wrong, even though Thomas never spoke about it. Weeks passed, and the distance between them continued to grow. Margaret tried to stay patient, waiting for the day when Thomas would open up and share his troubles with her. But that day never came. Instead, she began to notice strange things, small changes in his behavior. He was always on his phone, texting late into the night, and sometimes he would come home with a strange scent on his clothes that wasn't her perfume. Then, there was the moment when Margaret stumbled upon a letter hidden in the back of Thomas's drawer. The letter was addressed to him by someone named Clara. Margaret didn't know who this Clara was, but the words on the paper were enough to make her blood run cold. It was a letter filled with longing, with promises of a future together, and with declarations of love. Margaret couldn't believe what she was reading. Her world crumbled beneath her feet. The woman Thomas had been spending so much time with wasn't just a colleague or a friend. She was someone much more, someone Thomas had grown to care for deeply. It wasn't long after that Margaret discovered the truth. Thomas had been seeing Clara for months. He had been unfaithful to her, and the realization hit Margaret like a ton of bricks. The pain was overwhelming. How could Thomas, the man she loved, the man she had trusted, do this to her? She had never imagined that her perfect life would shatter like this. But as the truth unfolded, Margaret knew one thing for sure: she had to confront Thomas. She had to understand why he had chosen Clara over her. And so, she waited for the right moment. She watched and waited as Thomas grew more distant, as Clara's presence in their lives became more evident. Finally, the day came when Margaret couldn't stand it any longer. She had to see for herself what was going on. She had to confront her husband, face to face, and demand answers. That was the day Margaret had arrived home early from work, only to find Thomas and Clara together in their living room. They were laughing, talking, sharing moments that should have been hers. Margaret stood there, her heart breaking as she realized just how much had been taken from her. This was the moment when everything changed. But what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this confrontation would set off a chain of events that would alter the course of their lives forever. As the confrontation began, Clara's words echoed in Margaret's ears, and she felt a mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. But there was something else, something in Clara's eyes, that made Margaret pause. Was there more to this story than she realized? Would Margaret's determination to save her marriage lead her down a path she couldn't come back from? With every passing second, the stakes grew higher. Margaret could feel it, the secret Clara was hiding, the truth that was yet to be revealed. The only question now was, what would happen when Margaret uncovered that secret? Margaret stood there, her chest tight, her mind racing. She had come to confront Thomas, to demand answers, to reclaim the life that she thought had been taken from her. But Clara's sudden words, her calm, almost cryptic declaration that Margaret wasn't the only one who knew how to keep a secret, froze her in place. What did Clara mean? Was there something Margaret didn't know? Thomas turned around slowly, his face pale. For the first time in months, he looked genuinely startled, almost guilty. His mouth opened as if he was about to say something, but no words came out. Clara, however, stepped in front of him, as if protecting him from what was to come. She gave Margaret a look that was both knowing and defiant, and that only made the pit in Margaret's stomach grow deeper. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions, Margaret," Clara said, her voice smooth, though there was an undercurrent of something dark in her tone. "And I'm sure you're wondering what I'm doing here, but you don't know the full story yet. If you did, things might make a bit more sense." Margaret could barely breathe. The sting of betrayal was so sharp, so overwhelming that it clouded her thoughts. She wanted to scream at Thomas, to demand that he explain himself. But Clara's words seemed to reach her in a way that nothing Thomas had said or done ever had. "The full story?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "What full story?" Clara took a step closer, her eyes meeting Margaret's with an almost unsettling intensity. "You see, there's more to Thomas and me than you think. And more to your marriage than you ever knew. But there's something you need to know, something that changes everything." Before Margaret could react, Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse and filled with regret. "Margaret, I never wanted it to be like this. I should have told you earlier, but—" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The desperation in Thomas's voice didn't reach her. Not yet. She couldn't focus on him. Not when Clara's words still hung in the air. "What is it?" Margaret demanded. "What is it that I don't know?" Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Thomas, and for a brief moment, Margaret could see the subtle connection between them, an unspoken understanding that made her blood run cold. Clara's lips parted to speak again, but this time it was Thomas who spoke first, his voice shaky but clear. "Margaret," he said, his voice breaking, "there's something I've kept from you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. The truth is, I didn't leave you for Clara. Not really. I left because of something else. Something I thought would protect you. But now, I realize that the truth might do more harm than good." Margaret felt a wave of confusion wash over her. Thomas had left her, hadn't he? What else could there be? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle, but nothing made sense. She looked at Clara, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What are you talking about?" she demanded again, her voice shaking. "Just tell me everything." Clara seemed to hesitate, her eyes flickering between Margaret and Thomas, as if weighing something in her mind. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. "I think it's time, Thomas," she said gently. "You can't keep hiding it." Thomas swallowed hard, looking at the ground before lifting his eyes to meet Margaret's. "I never wanted to hurt you, Margaret, but I thought this was the only way. The truth is, I was trying to protect you from something that could have destroyed us both." Margaret felt a chill run through her. "What are you talking about?" she repeated, but this time her voice was quieter, edged with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Thomas took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for the words he was about to say. Before I met you, before we even got married, I was involved in something. A secret that I thought was long buried. But when I met Clara, I realized that everything I had tried to forget was coming back. And I couldn't let you be part of it. I couldn't risk you getting hurt. So I made a choice. I pushed you away, hoping that would protect you. But I see now that it was the wrong choice. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Margaret's head spun. What was he talking about? What secret was he hiding? She could feel her knees begin to tremble, but she forced herself to stay standing, her eyes locked on Thomas. What secret? What could be so terrible that you had to push me away for it? Thomas looked down again, his face pale, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Margaret's heart pounded as she waited, hoping for some clarity, for some explanation that would make all of this make sense. But when he finally spoke, it was a whisper, almost too quiet to hear. "I'm not who you think I am, Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm not just some ordinary man. I have a past that's dangerous. And Clara, she's not just a lover. She's a part of that past. A past that I thought I had escaped. But now it's back. And I can't protect you from it anymore." Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't understand what Thomas was saying. What was he hiding? What was this dark past he was talking about? And why had he never told her about it? All her life, Margaret had trusted Thomas with her heart, with her future. How could he have kept such a secret from her? Clara stepped forward, her eyes now filled with a kind of knowing sorrow. "It's true, Margaret," she said softly. "Thomas wasn't just hiding from his past. He was running from it. And now, everything he feared is coming for both of you." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her chest. The words Clara spoke were like an icy wind, cold and sharp. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if everything she had known was unraveling before her eyes. But even as the shock began to settle in, she felt a sense of determination. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what was happening. Because whatever it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But just as Margaret opened her mouth to demand more answers, the sound of a door slamming open echoed through the house. Margaret turned, her eyes wide with fear. A figure stood in the doorway, a man dressed in dark clothing, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. And the look on his face made Margaret's blood run cold. "You've made a big mistake, Thomas," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You've let her in on things you should have kept hidden. Now it's too late." The room went silent, and the air felt thick with tension. Margaret had no idea who this man was, but she could feel the danger in his presence. And with that, the true danger of their situation became clear. Everything was about to change. Again, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The man in the doorway, cloaked in shadows, radiated an aura of menace that sent a chill through her spine. He didn't look like anyone she knew, and yet, there was something in his gaze that told her that his arrival was no coincidence. Thomas, Clara, and the stranger stood frozen, as if caught in some tangled web of secrets and betrayal. Margaret's eyes darted between Thomas and Clara, her mind racing. Who was this man? Why was he here? And what did he mean by, "You've made a big mistake"? Who are you?" Margaret finally managed to ask, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The man didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward slowly, his boots clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. With each step, the tension in the air thickened, and Margaret felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She instinctively took a step back, her hand brushing against the back of a chair as if seeking something to hold on to. But there was nothing to brace herself against. Nothing could prepare her for what was coming. Thomas seemed to shrink in on himself, his face pale and filled with a kind of dread that Margaret had never seen before. He was usually the strong one, the one who always had everything under control. But now, in the presence of this stranger, he looked like a man who had lost all sense of power. Clara, too, was standing rigid, her eyes wide but strangely resigned. "His name is Damon." Clara finally spoke up, her voice low and tight. "He's part of Thomas's past. A part that neither of you should have ever been involved in." Damon's lips twisted into a smirk as he took another step forward, clearly enjoying the fear he was instilling in them. "Oh, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You always were so protective of Thomas. But you should have known better. He's been running from this for too long. Running from me. running from the life he chose to leave behind. And now, here we are. Margaret looked at Thomas, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Running from what? What was Damon talking about? Thomas's secret had been bad enough, but now it seemed like there was a much deeper, darker story she had yet to understand. Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret, I never wanted you to get involved in this. You don't deserve any of this. Damon and we were involved in things that you can't even imagine. I tried to leave it all behind, but Damon found me. He's been hunting me, waiting for the right moment to pull me back in. Margaret's knees nearly buckled beneath her. Things you can't imagine? What did that even mean? Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear. Everything she had known about Thomas, the man she loved, was starting to feel like a lie. He wasn't just a man with a complicated job or a busy schedule. He was hiding something so dangerous that even his own past was now coming back to haunt them. Damon's eyes glinted as he watched Thomas, his gaze full of disdain. Running, hiding, it doesn't matter, he said coldly. You can't escape what's coming. And now, Margaret, now you're part of this too. You think you're safe, but you're not. Margaret recoiled, her heart skipping a beat. Part of this? What did that mean? Before she could process the implication of Damon's words, Thomas rushed to her side, grabbing her by the shoulders. His touch was firm but shaky, his grip tight as if trying to anchor her in the midst of the chaos. Margaret, listen to me, he said desperately. I never wanted you to get involved. I swear I didn't, but it's too late. He won't stop until he gets what he wants, and neither will the people he works for. The mention of people made Margaret's blood run cold. What was he talking about? Was this some criminal organization? What kind of man had she married? Clara finally spoke again, her voice cracking with emotion. I didn't want this for you, Thomas. I didn't want her involved either. She looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with something that resembled guilt. But the truth is, Damon isn't the only one after you. There are others who know everything. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure you pay for what you've done. Margaret's world tilted again. The past Thomas had tried to escape was not just a shadow. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and now it was hunting them both. What did you do, Thomas? Margaret whispered, the fear in her voice barely contained. What are you running from? And who are these people? What is going on? Thomas shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. I thought I could leave it behind, he said. I thought I could have a normal life with you. But the past always catches up. And now they've found me. I don't know what to do, Margaret. I don't know how to protect you. A moment of silence passed, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Damon took another step forward, his presence almost suffocating. The past is the past, Thomas, Damon said coldly. But you're not getting out of this. Not this time. And neither is she. Margaret's heart raced. The look in Damon's eyes was like the gaze of a predator closing in on its prey. Everything Thomas had said before, everything he had hidden from her, suddenly seemed far less important than what was happening now. She realized with a sickening feeling that the danger wasn't just about to threaten Thomas. It was about to swallow her whole as well. Just as the tension in the room became unbearable, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. Damon's face twisted with fury. His eyes widened in alarm as he turned toward the window. You've got to be kidding me, he growled, his voice low and menacing. Margaret, barely able to process what was happening, felt her pulse quicken. What now? Who was coming for them? And why did the arrival of the sirens seem to send Damon into a frenzy? The sirens grew louder, approaching rapidly. The sound was deafening. And then, the door slammed open again. Margaret gasped as a group of armed men burst into the room, their eyes scanning the surroundings like hunters tracking their prey. Damon didn't hesitate. He spun on his heel, moving quickly toward the back door, his expression cold and determined. Get her out of here, he ordered. Now! Margaret's stomach churned. Who were these people? What was going on? Everything she thought she knew about her life, about Thomas, about herself, was falling apart. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. As Damon and the armed men retreated into the shadows, Margaret realized she was no longer just fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her life. And the secret Thomas had kept hidden for so long, it was about to become the key to everything. The air was thick with tension as the men in dark suits filled the room, their eyes sharp and calculating. Margaret's heart was racing, her chest constricted with fear. What had just happened? One moment, Damon had been looming in the doorway, threatening them with his words. The next moment, armed men had poured into the house, and Damon had vanished into the night like a shadow. Thomas stood frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked helpless, like a man who had run out of options. Margaret's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who were these people? Why had they come? And most terrifying of all, why was Thomas involved with them? One of the armed men, a tall figure with a dark scar running down his cheek, moved forward. His eyes never left Margaret as he spoke, his voice low and intimidating. "You need to come with us." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What? No, I don't understand. What's happening? Who are you people?" Her voice was shaking, but she couldn't let herself back down. "Not now." The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Thomas, who had finally managed to tear his eyes away from the door Damon had escaped through. His expression was filled with regret, but also with something darker, fear. Fear for himself, but also fear for Margaret. "Thomas," the man with the scar said, his voice sharp, "we don't have time for explanations. She's already seen too much. We need to move." Margaret's thoughts raced, her mind struggling to piece together the puzzle that had been unfolding. "Move where?" she demanded. "What's going on?" Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the scarred man cut him off. "You don't have the luxury of time, lady. Come with us and you'll get your answers." Margaret stood her ground, unwilling to be intimidated, though fear gripped her heart. "No, I'm not going anywhere until Thomas tells me what's going on. I don't care who you are or why you're here. He's my husband and I deserve to know the truth." The room fell silent. The men stood still, waiting. The scarred man gave Thomas a pointed look, as if to say, "It's your move." Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Margaret's for the first time since Damon had entered the house. There was a heaviness in his eyes, an apology that he didn't know how to express. Finally, he spoke, his voice shaky but clear. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to get involved in any of this. But now it's too late. You have to come with them. They'll explain everything that's been hidden from you." Margaret's heart twisted in her chest, her mind screaming with disbelief. Everything that's been hidden from you. Thomas had just confirmed that there was so much more to this story than she could have ever imagined. Her world, which had seemed so solid and predictable just a few hours ago, was now a maze of secrets, lies, and dangers that she didn't even understand. But as much as her body screamed to run, to escape, she knew that she couldn't stay here. Not with the men in the room, and with Thomas looking so broken. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, of understanding what was really happening, she had no choice but to follow them. "Fine," Margaret said, her voice steady, though her insides were screaming. "I'll go with you. But I'm not leaving without the answers. I won't let Thomas." "Good," the scarred man interrupted her, his expression unreadable. "Then let's go." The men moved quickly, guiding her toward the door, their hands hovering just close enough to make it clear they weren't offering any options. Thomas reached out as she walked past, his hand brushing hers in a silent plea. But Margaret couldn't look at him, not yet. She had so many questions that needed answers before she could even begin to process the truth. As they stepped out onto the porch, Margaret was greeted by the cold night air. The moon hung high above them, casting an eerie glow over the scene. A sleek black car was parked at the end of the driveway, its engine idling, waiting for them. The men ushered her into the car without a word, and Thomas followed behind her, his face filled with guilt. But he didn't protest. He didn't argue. The car sped away from the house, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way down a winding road. Margaret's eyes never left Thomas as they drove, her mind swirling with 1,000 unanswered questions. Why hadn't he told her about Damon? Why had he kept this dangerous secret hidden from her all this time? And who was Damon really? What was his connection to Thomas? As they traveled through the night, the city lights fading behind them, the scarred man turned to Margaret. "You're asking a lot of questions," he said gruffly. "You'll get answers soon enough. Just keep quiet for now. There's no need to make this harder than it has to be." Margaret clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. She had no choice but to trust them, at least for now. But that didn't mean she would stay silent. She needed to understand what was happening. She had to. The car made its way through the darkened streets until they reached an old, industrial area. The buildings here were abandoned, their windows dark and empty, the streets eerily silent. The car pulled into a large, gated compound. The gates opened with a mechanical groan, and the car passed through, heading toward a large, imposing building in the distance. The car stopped in front of the building, and Margaret was ushered out, followed closely by Thomas. The scarred man led them through a set of heavy doors into a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was thick, smelling of metal and dust. The walls were bare, the floor cold beneath her feet. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence hanging over them like a heavy weight. Finally, they reached a large door. The scarred man knocked twice, then turned the handle, opening the door to reveal a room filled with people. A few of them were sitting at a long, polished table, their faces stern and unreadable. At the head of the table sat a man who appeared to be in his late 40s. His hair was dark, his face sharp and angular. He had an air of authority, and when he looked up at Margaret, his piercing gaze felt like it could see right through her. "Sit," he said curtly, pointing to the empty chair across from him. Margaret did as she was told, her body tense as she sat down. She wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't the place for a fight. Not yet. The man studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I assume Thomas has told you nothing of what's really going on. But I'll make it clear to you now. You're involved in something much bigger than you realize." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Something bigger? Who are you?" she demanded, her voice strong despite the fear bubbling in her chest. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him as he stared at her. Then finally he spoke. "You'll learn soon enough," he said, his tone cold. "But first, you need to understand that nothing you thought you knew about your husband is true. The man you married is gone. And the man you're with now, he's a different kind of man altogether." Margaret's mind reeled. The secrets were piling up, each one darker than the last. But one thing was clear. The truth was finally starting to come into focus. And what she would learn next would change everything. The room was unnervingly silent, the air thick with the weight of the man's words. Margaret could feel her heart racing as she looked around the table at the strangers sitting in front of her. Every one of them had a cold, calculating expression, as if they were used to making decisions that affected people's lives without a second thought. She was in a room with people who knew something about Thomas, something that had been kept hidden from her. And it was becoming increasingly clear that she had no idea what kind of world she had married into. The man at the head of the table leaned forward, his fingers still steepled together, his eyes never leaving Margaret's. There was a sharpness to his gaze, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a move. Margaret felt exposed under that stare, but she refused to look away. She wasn't going to cower now, not when everything she had known was falling apart. "You want answers?" the man said finally, his voice like gravel. "Fine, but I'll tell you this once and only once. After that, you'll have to make a choice." Margaret clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. No matter how ugly it was, she needed to know. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. "Just tell me," she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "Tell me everything. Who are you? What does Thomas have to do with all of this? And why are you dragging me into it?" The man glanced at the other figures around the table, then back at Margaret. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, studying her. Finally he spoke. "Thomas is part of something much bigger than you realize," he said slowly, as if carefully weighing every word. "He was once a key player in a network of operatives, a man trained for a very different life than the one you thought you knew. But that life, it's been chasing him for years. It doesn't let go easily." Margaret's mind struggled to keep up with the information. Operatives? Trained for a different life? She had always known that Thomas had a mysterious past, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "Operatives for what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, almost afraid to hear the answer. The man's lips twitched slightly, as if amused by her question. "For an organization. A covert one. Think of them as a network of spies, infiltrators, and people who operate in the shadows. It's a world most people never see, and for good reason." The words hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating Margaret's understanding of the world she had known. Spies? Infiltrators? Her mind was spinning. She couldn't reconcile the man sitting in front of her, the one she had loved for so long, with the description that this man was painting. This wasn't the Thomas she had married. The one who came home every night, who held her in his arms and promised her that they'd always be safe. This wasn't the man who had made her laugh or shared their dreams for the future. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "Why didn't you tell me any of this, Thomas? I had the right to know. I had the right to understand what I was marrying into." Thomas's face was pale, his expression tortured. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally he spoke, his voice full of regret. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his words barely audible. "I thought if I told you the truth, it would ruin everything. I didn't want you to live in fear. But now it's too late." Margaret felt a sudden surge of anger rise in her chest, the intensity of it almost overwhelming. "Too late," she echoed, her voice rising. "You kept me in the dark for all these years, and now you're telling me it's too late?" The man at the head of the table raised his hand, silencing Margaret's outburst with a gesture. "You need to listen, Margaret," he said, his voice cold but not unkind. "You think you're angry now, but you don't understand the gravity of the situation. You've just scratched the surface. This isn't a game. There are people out there who will do anything to get what they want, and they'll stop at nothing to destroy anyone in their way." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. People who would destroy everything. What had Thomas gotten himself involved in? And why had he felt the need to protect her from the truth? She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he had done what he thought was best for her, but the depth of the deception was too much to ignore. The man at the table leaned forward, his hands pressed together. "You have a choice, Margaret," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You can walk away from all of this. We can wipe your memory of everything you've seen and heard. You can go back to your life, to the life you thought you knew. But understand this. Once you walk out that door, you'll never be able to come back. You'll never have a chance to find out what's really going on. You'll live your life in ignorance, but you'll be safe." Margaret's mind was racing. Walk away. That sounded like the easiest option. Just forget all of this and go back to her old life. But was that what she really wanted? Was she really willing to let Thomas go? To let this mystery consume them both, without ever knowing the full truth? The man continued, his tone unwavering. "But if you choose to stay, then you'll be involved. You'll know everything, whether you're ready or not. And it won't be easy. It'll be dangerous. You'll face challenges and threats that you can't even begin to imagine." Margaret stared at him, her mind spinning. "Stay. Leave." She felt torn, caught between the life she knew and the terrifying reality that was slowly unfolding around her. She looked at Thomas, who was standing just behind her, his eyes pleading, filled with guilt and uncertainty. Her mind flashed back to everything that had led up to this moment. The moment she had caught Thomas with Clara, the moment she had discovered that he wasn't the man she thought he was, the moment she realized that her whole life was built on a lie. The truth was there, hanging in the air, but at what cost? Her heart ached for the life she had lost, the simple life that had once seemed so perfect. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling inside her, the need to understand, to know the truth. "I'll stay," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling but steady. "I need to know. I need to understand what's really going on." The man's eyes flickered with something akin to approval, though his face remained impassive. "Very well," he said. "You'll get your answers. But remember this, Margaret, once you enter this world, there's no going back. You'll be forever marked by it." Margaret nodded slowly, a quiet resolve settling over her. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away now. The man stood up, and the others at the table followed suit. "Let's begin," he said. "We have much to discuss." As Margaret looked at Thomas one last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real danger was just starting, and she was now tied to it in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. But whatever happened next, Margaret was ready. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. The room buzzed with an eerie silence after Margaret's declaration. She could feel the weight of her decision settling around her, like a heavy cloak. There was no turning back now. She had chosen to stay, to face the truth no matter how dangerous or terrifying it might be. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. What had she just done? Was she ready for the world that was about to unfold before her? The man at the head of the table gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, signaling that the conversation was about to shift. "Very well," he said again, his voice firm and authoritative. "You've made your choice. Now let's begin." Margaret looked at Thomas one last time. His face was pale, his eyes filled with an unreadable mix of guilt and relief. It was clear that he was deeply relieved that she had chosen to stay. But there was also a sorrow in his expression, as if he knew how much danger they were about to face together. He was no longer the man she had married, the man who had hidden things from her, but something much darker, much more complicated. The man who had spoken first, the one who had introduced himself as the leader of this mysterious group, motioned for them to sit down at the long table. Margaret hesitated for a moment before taking a seat, Thomas sitting beside her. The other figures around the table remained silent, their eyes observing her every move, their faces unreadable. She felt as though she were in a courtroom, being judged and scrutinized by people who already knew more about her life than she ever could have imagined. The leader of the group, a man whose name Margaret still didn't know, sat back in his chair and folded his hands in front of him. He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I assume you're wondering who we are and what all of this means," he began. "So let me start from the beginning. We are a faction, a network of individuals who operate in the shadows, influencing world events from behind the scenes. We've had our hands in many things, both good and bad. But the most important thing you need to understand is that your husband, Thomas, was once an integral part of this organization." Margaret's mind raced. She had thought she knew the man she married. He was a man of honor, someone she believed would always protect her. But now, everything she thought she knew about Thomas, about their life together, was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Thomas was trained in ways you can't begin to understand," the leader continued, his voice calm but filled with authority. "He was a part of a covert operation, a group of highly skilled operatives who carried out missions for us. But that was years ago, before he met you. He walked away from the life he knew and tried to build a normal life with you. Unfortunately, no one ever really escapes this world. It's always waiting, just beneath the surface." Margaret's heart pounded as she listened. Covert operations? Highly skilled operatives? Missions? This was beyond her comprehension. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She turned to Thomas, who was staring at the table, his face set in stone, his eyes distant. He hadn't said anything since she had made her decision to stay, and Margaret realized now that perhaps he wasn't just protecting her from this world. He was trying to protect her from the truth about himself. "Why didn't you tell me, Thomas?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Why did you hide this from me? Why didn't you trust me enough to be honest with me about who you really are?" Thomas looked at her, his eyes full of sorrow. "I never wanted you to be part of this life," he said quietly. "I thought I could escape it, that I could give you the life we both wanted. But I should have known better. They never let you go, Margaret. Once you're in, they never let you go." The man at the head of the table spoke again, his tone cutting through the tension in the room. "Thomas is right. There's no escaping this life. And now that you're involved, Margaret, there's no way to go back. You're part of the story, whether you like it or not." Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She felt the weight of his words like a heavy burden pressing down on her chest. She had made the choice to stay, but now that the reality of her decision was setting in, she wasn't sure she had fully understood what that choice would mean. She wasn't just married to a man with a dangerous past. She was now caught in the web of that past, entangled in a world she had never known existed. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the confusion and fear swirling inside her. The leader of the group looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Now you'll be trained. You'll learn what you need to survive in this world. You'll understand what Thomas was a part of, and you'll know how to protect yourself. We've been watching you both for some time, Margaret. We know that you're strong, that you're capable. But the world you're about to step into is not kind. It doesn't care about your past or your feelings. It cares about results, and it will push you to your limits." Margaret swallowed hard. "Training?" she repeated, almost in disbelief. "You want me to become part of this world? You want me to join you?" The leader didn't flinch. "You don't have a choice. You're already here. You've seen too much. And now that they know you're involved, you'll need to be prepared. You won't just be a bystander anymore. You'll be part of the team. And if you want to survive, you'll have to learn everything they know. Your life and Thomas's life depend on it. A wave of panic washed over Margaret. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had wanted answers, not to be thrust into a world of secrecy and danger. But the leader's words were clear, and there was a cold certainty in his voice that made her realize the gravity of her situation. If she didn't comply, if she didn't learn what they were about to teach her, she and Thomas would be doomed. Thomas reached over and placed his hand on hers, his grip tight, almost desperate. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never wanted this for you. But I swear, I'll do everything I can to protect you. I promise." Margaret looked at him, her heart aching. She could see how torn he was, how deeply he regretted the choices that had led them to this point. But in that moment, as she stared at the man she loved, something inside her hardened. There was no going back. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay, and she would face whatever came next with the same determination that had led her here. The leader of the group stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "We'll begin your training tomorrow," he said, his voice firm. "Be ready. You have a lot to learn." As Margaret stood to leave the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a new, terrifying chapter of her life. She had no idea what awaited her, but one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same again. Thomas followed her out of the room, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish things could have been different." Margaret turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't know what the future holds, Thomas. But we're in this together now. We'll face whatever comes side by side." And as they walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, Margaret couldn't help but feel a spark of something within her. A fierce determination to survive, to fight, and to uncover the truth about the world that had swallowed her whole. Because whatever came next, she wasn't going to face it alone. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and uncertainty. Margaret had known her life would change the moment she stepped into this strange new world, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of what was to come. The training sessions were grueling, relentless, and completely different from anything she had ever experienced. The people who had brought her into this world were experts in everything: combat, survival, intelligence gathering, and they were teaching her everything they knew. It wasn't a choice anymore, it was a necessity. The mornings began early, the cold light of dawn seeping through the narrow windows of the facility. Margaret would wake up in the small, sparse room they had assigned her, a room that had none of the comforts of home. There were no soft blankets or familiar pictures on the walls, just the bare essentials. A single bed, a desk, and a chair. Everything in this place was functional, utilitarian, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Each day began with physical training, pushing Margaret's body to its limits. They taught her how to fight, how to use her body as a weapon. She was taught to dodge, to strike, to defend herself against attackers much larger and stronger than she was. She felt her muscles ache after every session, but each day, she grew stronger, more confident in her abilities. But it wasn't just physical training. She learned how to use firearms, how to handle weapons with precision. She learned how to disappear into a crowd, how to hide, how to move quietly through the shadows. All the while, Thomas was there, though not as her instructor. He was going through the same training, but his sessions were more advanced, more specific to his past. He was more familiar with the operations and the techniques than Margaret, and he was often assigned to the more difficult tasks, the ones that pushed him to his limits. Yet, despite the distance that seemed to grow between them, Margaret could sense his worry. His eyes followed her when they trained, his expression filled with concern as if he feared the very world he had tried to protect her from. In the evenings, after the brutal training sessions, Margaret would sit in her room, exhausted and lost in her thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder if this would ever feel normal. Would she ever be able to adjust to this? Would she ever truly understand the world Thomas had come from? It was late one evening, after another exhausting day of training, that Margaret found herself in the facility's small, dimly lit cafeteria. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clink of a tray or the soft murmur of conversation between the operatives. Margaret sat alone at a table, stirring her meal absently, not really tasting it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the training, on Thomas, on the choices she had made. Suddenly, she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to find Clara standing there, her eyes watching Margaret with an inscrutable expression. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively straightened in her chair, her body tensing. She hadn't seen Clara much since that day in the hallway, but she knew Clara was still a significant part of Thomas's past, part of the world he had been trying to escape. "You look like you're deep in thought," Clara said, her voice low, almost too soft for the room. There was a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you adjusting to this life yet?" Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't respond right away. Clara's sudden appearance caught her off guard, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this an attempt to be friendly, or was there something more behind it? Margaret knew Clara wasn't a friend, not really, but she also couldn't help but wonder if Clara had any information about Thomas's past that might help her understand everything more clearly. "I'm getting by," Margaret said finally, her voice steady but guarded. "Just trying to keep up with everything they're throwing at me." Clara sat down across from Margaret without waiting for an invitation, her eyes studying her closely. "It's a lot to take in, I know," Clara said, her voice softer now, almost as if she were trying to comfort Margaret. "But you're doing well. Better than most." Margaret's brow furrowed slightly. "Thanks," she replied, unsure of Clara's true intentions. "But why are you here? You don't usually talk to me." Clara let out a quiet sigh, her gaze dropping to her hands for a moment before meeting Margaret's eyes again. "I know it must seem like I've been distant," Clara admitted, her voice tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. "But I've been in this world a lot longer than you. I know what it's like to be thrust into a world of secrets and danger. It's not easy, and I didn't want you to feel like you were alone." Margaret was taken aback by the sudden shift in Clara's demeanor. Could this be genuine? Or was it a carefully crafted attempt to manipulate her? After all, Clara had a history with Thomas, a history that was filled with uncertainty and betrayal. Margaret didn't know if she could trust her. "I'm not alone," Margaret said firmly. "I'm here with Thomas. He's the one I'm really trying to understand right now. He's the one who has kept me in the dark about all of this. I want answers from him, not from you." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but it was a smile that seemed tinged with something else, something more complex. "You think you know everything about Thomas? You think you understand him completely?" Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Thomas is not the man you think he is, Margaret. He's changed. He's hiding things from you, things that you don't want to know. And the more you push him for answers, the more you'll get hurt." Margaret's pulse quickened. Clara's words were like a dagger aimed straight at her heart. What did she mean by that? What was she trying to say about Thomas? Could it be true that he was hiding even more from her than she realized? "Don't listen to me, though," Clara continued, her voice soft but carrying an edge of warning. "You're going to have to figure that out for yourself." Margaret's head was spinning. She had been so focused on the immediate dangers, the training, the new life she was being forced into, that she hadn't fully processed what Clara had just said. Thomas was hiding something? What was he keeping from her? Why hadn't he told her? What could he possibly be hiding that would make him push her away like this? As the conversation ended, and Clara left the cafeteria without another word, Margaret's mind was consumed by questions. What was Clara trying to warn her about? What was Thomas hiding? The training was demanding, but the emotional weight of what Clara had said was even heavier. Margaret could feel the strain of living in this world of secrets and lies, and the more she learned, the less certain she became about who to trust. Later that night, as she lay in her bed, Margaret stared up at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events. The ache in her chest hadn't subsided. She thought of Thomas, his face, his pain, his desire to protect her. He had been through so much, and she knew that. But the question still lingered in her mind. How much of Thomas's past was he keeping from her? What was he trying to protect her from? And as the night stretched on, Margaret felt a deep, unsettling realization. The more she uncovered about this world, the more she realized that she was far from the only one with secrets. The world she had stepped into was full of hidden dangers, and she was just beginning to understand how deep the web of lies went. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring more answers. But they might be answers that she wasn't ready to hear. And when those answers came, they would change everything. The training continued, relentless and unforgiving. Every day, Margaret felt her body grow stronger, but her mind grew heavier with each passing hour. The more she learned, the more she understood that this was a world she could never escape. This was no longer a matter of simply protecting herself from danger. It was about survival, plain and simple. And each day she was being pulled further and further into a web of secrets, betrayals, and hidden motives that threatened to consume her. Despite the exhausting physical training, the mental strain was even worse. Every moment felt like a test. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in this place, everyone she encountered, was a part of something much darker, much more complex than she could have imagined. Even Thomas, the man she had loved and trusted, had become a stranger in her eyes. There were still too many unanswered questions about his past, and the more she tried to understand him, the more elusive the answers seemed. Margaret tried to get close to him, to find a way to reach the man she had married, but the distance between them had grown. The tender moments they once shared were now replaced by the cold, steely expressions of people who were being trained for something far beyond what she could comprehend. There were days when she would catch a glimpse of the old Thomas, the one who had made her laugh, the one who had held her in his arms at night, but those moments were fleeting, disappearing the moment she reached out for them. And then there was Clara. Despite her cryptic words and the warning she had given Margaret, there was still something about her that didn't sit right. Margaret couldn't ignore the fact that Clara was a part of this world, a world Margaret had never asked to be a part of. Clara's presence was a constant reminder of the life Thomas had once known, the life that he had tried to leave behind. But now Margaret couldn't help but wonder if Clara knew more than she was letting on. Was she really just a warning, as Clara had claimed, or was there something else going on between her and Thomas? The questions churned in Margaret's mind, and the more she thought about it, the more the answers eluded her. Was Thomas hiding something from her? Was Clara trying to protect her, or was she trying to manipulate her into something she didn't want to be a part of? One evening, after another grueling day of training, Margaret sat in the cafeteria alone, trying to clear her mind. She had been told to rest, to recover, but the weight of everything pressing down on her made it difficult to relax. The thoughts were spinning in her mind, and there was a sharp, gnawing feeling in her stomach that she couldn't shake. As she sat there, her thoughts interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Margaret didn't have to look up to know who it was. She could sense Thomas before he even reached her. His presence was undeniable, heavy with something she couldn't place. When he sat down across from her, she didn't speak at first. She was too lost in her own thoughts, still reeling from everything she had learned, everything she had yet to understand. "Margaret," Thomas said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "How are you holding up?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with determination. "I'm managing," she said flatly. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine, Thomas. This," she gestured around the room, "this is not the life I imagined. It's not the life I thought I was signing up for when we got married." Thomas's face tightened, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something darker, something she couldn't name. "I know," he said quietly. "I never wanted this for you. But this is the reality now. You're in this world, whether you want to be or not. And the sooner you accept that, the better off we'll both be." Margaret shook her head, the frustration rising in her chest. "That's not good enough, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need answers. I need to understand why you've kept all of this from me. Why haven't you told me what's really going on? What's so dangerous about this world? Why are we here?" Thomas's jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked like he was struggling to hold back something that wanted to break free. He stared at her for a long time, his gaze intense, but there was no warmth in it. Only coldness. Finally he spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "I can't tell you everything, Margaret. Not yet. You wouldn't understand. This isn't something you can just walk into and expect to understand. It's dangerous, and it's not something you can just learn." He sighed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of whatever he was carrying. "But I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to keep you safe." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Safe? How is keeping me in the dark keeping me safe, Thomas? How is training me like this, turning me into something I don't recognize, keeping me safe?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice interrupted them. "Is everything all right here?" It was the leader, the one who had been overseeing Margaret's training, his face stern as usual. Margaret looked up at him, feeling the weight of his gaze. "We're fine," Thomas said quickly, standing up abruptly. I'll speak to you later, Margaret. He turned to the leader and gave him a slight nod, signaling that their conversation was over. Margaret felt a pang of disappointment as she watched Thomas walk away. She wanted him to stay. She wanted to hear the truth from him, even if it hurt. But he wasn't ready to give her those answers. Not yet. The leader took Thomas's place, sitting down across from her with a quiet intensity. Margaret didn't say anything at first, but after a long silence, she couldn't hold back her frustration. "Why won't he tell me the truth?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why does he keep hiding things from me? What's so dangerous that he can't even tell his own wife?" The leader's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Sometimes, people keep secrets to protect others. Thomas's past is filled with things that could destroy him, and destroy anyone close to him. He's trying to shield you from that danger, even if it means keeping you in the dark. Margaret shook her head, her eyes burning with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't need him to protect me," she said fiercely. "I need him to trust me. I need him to be honest with me." The leader studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You'll learn soon enough that trust doesn't come easily in this world. People keep secrets for a reason. And sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lie." Margaret swallowed hard, her mind spinning. What did that even mean? And what had Thomas gotten himself involved in? What was this world, this dangerous, shadowy world, that they were all a part of? But as the leader stood up and left her alone with her thoughts, one thing became clear. Whatever had brought them here, whatever Thomas had done, there was no going back. Margaret had made her choice. She had chosen to stay, to fight, and now she was in deeper than she had ever imagined. As the days passed, her training became more intense, more focused. The facility was full of people who had once lived normal lives, just like her, only to be pulled into this dark world of secrets, shadows, and danger. She wasn't alone, not completely. But even with the others around her, Margaret felt more isolated than ever. The more she learned, the less she understood, and the deeper she fell into a life that she had never asked for. And all the while, Thomas remained distant, locked away in his own world of regret and guilt. Margaret knew deep down that the truth about Thomas was somewhere out there. But the question was, would she be able to handle it when it finally came to light? The answer, she feared, was something she might not be ready to face. Days turned into weeks, and still, the truth about Thomas seemed just out of reach. The training became even more demanding as the days passed, the hours blending into one long blur of pain, exhaustion, and silence. Margaret's body was becoming stronger, faster, more agile with each passing day. She was no longer the woman who had once worried about dinner parties or the right way to fold laundry. No, she was becoming something else entirely, a woman trained for a world she had never chosen. Yet, as much as her body adapted to this new life, her mind was still caught in the web of questions. Thomas, Clara, the leader, they all carried secrets, each one heavier than the last. But the weight of Thomas's secrets was the heaviest. Every time Margaret tried to approach him, to ask him about his past, he would retreat further into himself. His eyes would cloud over, and the walls he had built around himself seemed to grow higher, thicker, stronger. It had been a few days since their last conversation in the cafeteria. Margaret hadn't seen him much after that. There was always distance between them now, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She knew the training was hard for him too, but it felt like he was shutting her out more than ever. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Margaret found herself once again sitting alone in the cafeteria, nursing a sore body and a weary mind. She picked at her food, hardly tasting it, as her thoughts spun around in endless circles. She had made the decision to stay, but now she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right one. This world was not one of simplicity. It was a world filled with danger, shadows, and people who operated in ways that Margaret could not comprehend. Her hand rested idly on the edge of her tray when she felt a familiar presence beside her. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was Thomas. He sat down slowly, as if unsure of how to approach her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Margaret could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the unspoken words that lingered between them. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of silence that hung heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice soft but filled with a sadness Margaret hadn't heard before. "I know I've been distant," he said, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I don't want to be, but I don't know how to make it right. I don't know how to tell you what you need to hear. Margaret's heart skipped a beat at his words. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Thomas would finally open up, when he would finally share the truth about who he really was. You've been shutting me out, Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. I can't keep living like this, Thomas. I need to know the truth. I need to understand what's going on. Why are we here? What happened to you? What happened to us? Thomas turned to her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. For the first time in what felt like forever, his guard seemed to slip, just a little. I never wanted this for you, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. But there's a part of me, a part of my past, that I can't escape. And I thought I could protect you from it. I thought I could keep you safe. But the more I kept from you, the more I pulled away. And now it feels like I've lost you. Margaret's heart ached as she listened to him. She could hear the anguish in his voice, and for a moment she almost reached out to him, to comfort him, to reassure him. But something held her back. The pain wasn't just his. It was hers too. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now everything felt so fractured, so broken. I don't want to lose you, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. But the truth is more complicated than you can imagine. Margaret's eyes searched his face, desperate for some sign, some clue, to explain what he was trying to say. What truth? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What is so terrible that you can't even tell me? Thomas hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the door, as though searching for an escape. I wish I could tell you everything, he said, his words heavy with sorrow. But there are things about my past, that would put both of us in danger if you knew. If I tell you the truth, it won't just change everything between us. It'll change everything you think you know about your life. Margaret's chest tightened at his words. She could feel the walls he had built around himself, thick and unyielding, closing in once again. The truth, whatever it was so dangerous that it could shatter not just their relationship, but her entire life. And yet, she couldn't understand why he couldn't trust her with it. Why couldn't he let her in? I'm not afraid of the truth, Thomas, Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the torrent of emotions swirling inside her. I need you to trust me. Whatever it is, whatever you've done, we can face it together. But Thomas didn't answer. He just looked at her with those haunted eyes, and for a moment, Margaret could see how much he was struggling. He wanted to tell her. She could feel it. But whatever this secret was, it was something so dark, so dangerous, that it held him in its grip. Please, Margaret whispered, the desperation creeping into her voice. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending like everything is okay when you're shutting me out. Thomas reached across the table, his hand trembling as it rested on hers. I want to tell you, he said, his voice hoarse. I do. But it's not just my secret anymore. It's a secret that's bigger than both of us. And the moment I tell you, everything changes. Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What kind of secret was this? What had Thomas gotten himself into? I can't lose you, Thomas, Margaret said softly, her voice full of vulnerability. But I can't keep living in the dark either. Thomas sighed deeply, his face etched with pain. I know, he whispered. I know. But I need you to understand. Once you know the truth, there's no turning back. There's no going back to the life you had before. You'll be a part of this world, whether you like it or not. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Margaret didn't know what to say. She could feel the weight of the decision before her. She had come this far. She had already stepped into this dangerous world, but now she was being asked to take another step, to learn the truth, no matter what the cost. Thomas's eyes met hers, his expression softening just a little. I promise you, Margaret, he said quietly. I never wanted you to be a part of this. But now it's too late. The truth is coming. And when it does, we'll both have to face it. Margaret stared at him, her mind racing. She had made her choice when she decided to stay, but now she realized that the path ahead was much more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Whatever Thomas's secret was, it was about to change everything. And there was no way out. The next few days passed like a storm, heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about what Thomas had said. Once you know the truth, there's no turning back. The words echoed in her mind like a warning bell, growing louder with each passing hour. What could be so dangerous, so dark, that he couldn't even share it with her? What was this world that he had kept her in the dark about for so long? She spent her time training, her body growing stronger and more skilled, but her mind was elsewhere. Every move she made, every lesson she learned, was now colored by the shadows of Thomas's secrets. She felt more isolated than ever. The walls between them were closing in, and the more she tried to break them down, the more they seemed to grow higher, thicker, and stronger. Thomas, too, seemed distant. The guilt in his eyes was unbearable, and it seemed like the more he wanted to tell her, the more he kept himself closed off. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. There was no tenderness, no love in his gaze, only sorrow and regret. Margaret didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. She didn't know how to make him see that she wasn't afraid of the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. But she couldn't force him to open up. He was locked inside his own fears and regrets, and she had no choice but to wait. Then late one night it happened. Margaret was walking down the long, dimly lit hallway of the facility after another exhausting day of training. The quiet hum of the overhead lights filled the space as she made her way toward her room. She had learned to navigate these hallways like the back of her hand, her footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floors. But tonight, something felt different. There was a shift in the air, something that she couldn't quite place. She passed a few operatives, their eyes briefly flicking toward her as she walked by. They all seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable, like soldiers before a battle. Margaret slowed her pace as she reached the corner near her door. And then she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, a whisper, coming from the shadows ahead of her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively froze, her breath catching in her throat. Margaret! The voice was low, familiar, and full of urgency. It was Thomas. Her body tensed as she slowly turned the corner. There, standing in the shadows, was Thomas. He was looking at her with a mixture of fear and determination. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale, his eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. "Thomas," she asked softly, her voice betraying the uncertainty she was feeling. "What's going on?" He stepped forward, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. His movements were tense, cautious. He reached out, taking her hand gently but firmly. "We don't have much time," he said quickly. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she searched his eyes, searching for some sign of what he was about to say. She didn't know whether she was ready, but she knew this was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when he would finally open up. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "This is going to sound crazy, but I need you to believe me. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I've been part of an organization for years, one that operates in the shadows. A group that handles high-level covert operations, everything from espionage to sabotage. They recruited me when I was young, and I was trained to do things, horrible things, that I'm not proud of." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her mind was spinning. Espionage? Sabotage? She had always suspected that Thomas had a past, but this was more than she had ever imagined. She had always known there were pieces of his life that he had hidden, but she hadn't known it was this dark, this dangerous. "That's why I left," Thomas continued, his voice strained with emotion. "I tried to get out. I thought I could build a life with you, a life away from all of this. But they don't let you leave, Margaret. Not when you've done the things I've done. They always find you. And now they've found us." Margaret's heart raced. "Who are they, Thomas? Who is after us?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to brace himself for what he was about to say. "It's the organization I was part of. They're called the Consortium. They control everything behind the scenes, from governments to corporations. They've been around for decades, manipulating events, pulling the strings. And now they want me back. They want me to finish what I started, and they won't stop until they get what they want." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. The Consortium? The thought of an organization with so much power, so much influence, sent a cold shiver down her spine. She had heard rumors about secret societies and shadowy organizations, but she had never imagined that Thomas had been a part of something so vast, so all-encompassing. "But why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid that saying the words out loud would make it all too real. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Thomas looked at her, his face full of regret. "I wanted to protect you. I thought I could shield you from all of this. But I see now that I've been lying to you, that I've been keeping you in the dark to protect myself. But the truth is, they've already found us. They know about you, Margaret. And they won't stop until they get what they want." A cold silence fell between them as Margaret processed what Thomas had just told her. Her mind was reeling with the implications of his words. The consortium had been watching them. They had been a part of their lives without even knowing it. Everything they had done, everything they had believed, was now called into question. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Thomas took a deep breath, his expression hardening. "We fight. We fight back. And we do whatever it takes to protect ourselves. But we can't do it alone. I need you, Margaret. I need you to help me, to fight with me. There's no other way. And there's no going back now." Margaret looked into his eyes, her mind racing. She had always known that Thomas had a past, but this was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The consortium wasn't just an enemy. They were a force, a shadow that controlled everything. They could destroy everything Margaret had known. And the only way out was through. As the weight of Thomas's words settled in, Margaret felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had already made the choice to stay. And now she was being asked to take the final step into a world of shadows, a world of secrets, and a world of danger. She would not back down. "Then let's do it," Margaret said, her voice steady, filled with resolve. "Let's fight." And with that, she knew that there was no turning back. They were in this together now, and whatever came next, they would face it head-on. The truth had finally come to light, and everything had changed. The air around them seemed to hold its breath as Thomas and Margaret stood in the shadows of the dimly lit hallway. The weight of Thomas's confession hung heavily in the space between them, like a storm about to break. Margaret's mind was racing. She had made her decision, but the magnitude of what they were about to face was beginning to sink in. The consortium. The name alone sent a chill down her spine. An organization so powerful that it controlled governments, corporations, everything that happened behind the scenes. They were the puppeteers, pulling strings in the dark, and Thomas had once been one of their most valuable operatives. Margaret had been thrust into this world, a world of danger, shadows, and secrets, without any choice in the matter. But now she had made her choice. She was in this with Thomas, and together, they would fight for their lives. Thomas squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with something deeper than regret now, determination. "We can't do this alone," he whispered. "There's a safe house. A place where we can regroup, plan. But it's not just about survival anymore, Margaret. It's about taking them down. We have to find a way to expose them, to stop them." Margaret nodded, her resolve solidifying. Taking them down. The words felt like a heavy burden, but she knew there was no turning back. The truth was out, and now it was time to act. No more hiding, no more running. It was time to fight back. The safe house was in an isolated location, hidden deep in the mountains, far from the watchful eyes of the consortium. They had to leave immediately. The urgency in Thomas's voice told Margaret that they were running out of time. The consortium was already looking for them, and every moment they spent waiting made them more vulnerable. They moved quickly, slipping through the hallways of the facility like shadows, their footsteps barely audible against the cold stone floors. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at them as they passed. Margaret's heart raced, every sense heightened, her nerves on edge. This wasn't just a training session. This wasn't just a mission. This was survival. When they reached the garage, Thomas pulled her into a black sedan that was parked under the flickering fluorescent lights. He didn't say a word as he slid behind the wheel and started the engine. Margaret didn't ask questions. She knew better than to speak now. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as the car hummed to life. Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The drive was long, and the silence between them stretched out like a tightrope. Margaret wanted to speak, wanted to ask him everything, but she knew this wasn't the time. This was the moment when they had to focus. This was the moment when the world they had been avoiding came crashing down. Every decision from here on out could mean the difference between life and death. The scenery outside the window blurred as they drove further into the mountains. The city lights faded, replaced by the dark expanse of wilderness. As they ascended higher into the mountains, the trees grew denser, and the air grew thinner. Margaret could feel the change in the atmosphere, a sense of foreboding hanging over everything. Finally, after what felt like hours, they arrived at a secluded cabin tucked away in a valley surrounded by towering pines. The cabin was modest, small and unassuming, but it had the feel of a place that had seen its fair share of secrets. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone had been there recently. It was exactly what they needed. They stepped out of the car, and Thomas led her to the door, his eyes scanning the surroundings cautiously. Margaret's nerves were on high alert, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was the moment of truth. Everything had led to this. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a few low-burning lanterns. There was a small wood stove in the corner, and a single table with 2 chairs. The atmosphere was rustic, but there was a sense of cold efficiency about it. Everything had a purpose. Everything was practical. Thomas moved to the small wooden table and placed a large duffel bag on it, opening it to reveal a series of weapons, maps, and documents. Margaret felt a pang of unease as she looked at the contents, but she quickly pushed it aside. This was the world they had to live in now. "This is the plan," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to contact a few of my old contacts, people who are still loyal to me, people who know how to operate under the radar. We can't take down the consortium without their help. But we also need to be careful. If they've already figured out where we are, we don't have long before they come looking for us." Margaret nodded. She was ready to do whatever it took. "What's next?" she asked, her voice unwavering. Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "Next, we lay low. We contact the right people, get the intel we need. But it's not just about gathering information anymore. We need to hit them where it hurts. If we expose them for what they really are, it could bring everything down. Governments, corporations, anyone who's been helping them, they'll all turn on them. But that's the part that scares me the most." Margaret furrowed her brow. "Why?" she asked. "If we take them down, we're free, right?" Thomas's face softened, but the sadness never left his eyes. "It's not that simple. The consortium doesn't just control people. They control entire systems. They've got their hands in everything. And if we start digging into them, if we start pulling at the threads, we're going to bring down the whole system with us. That means everything we've known, everything we've built, it'll be gone." Margaret's mind reeled. The truth about the consortium was more overwhelming than she could have imagined. Exposing them would change the entire world. But there was no turning back now. They had already crossed the line. The truth had to come out. They had to take them down, no matter what the cost. "I'm in," Margaret said, her voice firm. "We do whatever it takes. No matter what happens, we're doing this together." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his gaze filled with admiration. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. Margaret squeezed his hand, her resolve hardening. "Then you don't have to do it alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope in Thomas's eyes. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. They had taken the first step into the unknown. And together, they would fight to take down the most powerful enemy they had ever faced. But even as they made their plans, they both knew the truth. The hardest part was just beginning. The days in the cabin were a blur of preparation and tension. Margaret and Thomas moved in a well-oiled routine, their every action a step toward dismantling the consortium. They worked in silence, poring over maps and documents, making connections, and laying out their strategy. But even as they worked tirelessly, the weight of their mission settled deeper on their shoulders. The closer they got to exposing the consortium, the more they could feel the danger creeping in, like a dark shadow slowly enveloping them. Thomas's old contacts had come through, reaching out to them with information and resources. They were allies from his past, people who had once worked with him in the covert world, and now they were the only ones who could help them fight back. But each new contact carried their own risks. Every conversation, every piece of information shared, had the potential to lead back to them. The consortium was everywhere. They were watching. They were waiting. And the moment they realized what Margaret and Thomas were doing, they would stop at nothing to eliminate them. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every time she looked at Thomas, she saw the same expression on his face, a mixture of determination and fear. He was haunted by his past, by the things he had done, and now he was dragging her into a world of danger that she could never have imagined. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had made the choice to stand by him, and she was going to see it through to the end. One afternoon, as they worked on decrypting a series of documents that had been delivered by one of Thomas's contacts, they were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively reached for the gun that was tucked into her waistband. She had been trained for this. She was prepared for anything. Thomas was already moving toward the door, his body tense, his hand hovering near the weapon strapped to his side. He motioned for Margaret to stay behind him, and she obeyed, her heart racing as she watched him open the door. Standing on the threshold was a man Margaret didn't recognize, but the moment he spoke, she knew he was one of Thomas's old allies. His face was sharp and weathered, his eyes alert, scanning the area around them before focusing on Thomas. "It's time," the man said in a low voice, his tone urgent. "They know. The consortium knows what you're planning. They've already started moving." Thomas's face went pale. "How soon?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "Too soon," the man replied. "They've got people on the ground, moving into position. If you don't act now, you won't get another chance." Margaret's pulse quickened as she exchanged a glance with Thomas. The moment of truth had arrived. The consortium was coming for them. "We need to move," Thomas said, his voice resolute. "Get the equipment ready. We don't have time to waste." Margaret nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline flood through her body. This was it. They had been preparing for this moment, and now it was here. They had no choice but to fight. The man handed Thomas a small, encrypted device. "This will give you access to the consortium's main database. You'll be able to pull the files you need, expose them for what they really are. But it's a one-way ticket. Once you're in, they'll know. You won't have long before they come for you." Thomas took the device, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. He turned to Margaret, his eyes meeting hers with a look that was both filled with sorrow and a fierce determination. "You ready for this?" he asked softly. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't hesitate. "Let's take them down." With that, they sprang into action. The next few hours were a blur of preparation, gathering equipment, and making sure the cabin was secure. They moved quickly, knowing that the consortium could be on their heels at any moment. But as the minutes ticked by, the urgency only grew. They had to act fast. As they loaded into the car and drove toward their destination, Margaret's mind raced. She could hear the roar of the engine, the pounding of her own heart, and yet, despite the danger surrounding them, there was a sense of clarity in her. This was the life they had chosen. This was the life she had chosen. And now, there was no turning back. They arrived at the location in the dead of night, a secure facility hidden deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the consortium. It was there that they would find the information they needed to expose the organization's true nature. The building loomed ahead, dark and silent. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their feet as they approached the entrance. Thomas gestured for Margaret to stay behind him as they made their way inside, their movements cautious, calculated. They knew that the moment they stepped through the door, everything would change. The consortium was watching. They were always watching. The building was eerily quiet, and the only lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls. It was like walking into the belly of the beast. Margaret's pulse was pounding in her ears, but she kept her focus. She had to trust Thomas. He had been here before. He knew what to do. They made their way through a series of narrow hallways, past locked doors, each one more ominous than the last. The tension was unbearable, but Margaret kept her breathing steady, her mind sharp. She had come this far. She wasn't going to stop now. Finally, they reached the room they had been searching for. The door was locked, but Thomas had the key. He stepped forward, inserting a code into the panel beside the door. There was a soft beep, and the door clicked open. Inside, they found the data they had been looking for, a server room filled with computers, each one connected to the vast network of the consortium. Thomas immediately went to work, plugging in the encrypted device and accessing the files. Margaret kept watch, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. She knew they didn't have much time. The consortium's forces would be closing in soon. Thomas worked quickly, pulling up files, scanning through sensitive documents, looking for the evidence they needed. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his hands trembling as he navigated the system. And then it happened. The alarm blared through the building, a deafening sound that sent a rush of adrenaline through Margaret's veins. They had been discovered. "Let's go!" Thomas shouted, grabbing Margaret's arm and pulling her toward the door. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the hallways, the sound of their pursuit growing louder. They had the evidence. They had the proof. But getting out alive was another matter entirely. They reached the exit, only to be met by a group of armed men, blocking their way. Margaret's heart sank. It was too late. They were trapped. But Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned to Margaret, his face hard with determination. "Get down!" he shouted. Without thinking, Margaret dropped to the ground, and a split second later, the world exploded in a hail of gunfire. She could hear the deafening roar of weapons, the crash of bullets against walls, but she didn't flinch. She was ready for this. They had come too far to be stopped now. Thomas was fighting, his movements fluid and precise, taking down their attackers one by one. The air was thick with tension as they made their way to the back door, their only chance at escape. But even as they neared the exit, Margaret knew the truth. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning.